AP is saying is that they're going to ask you one long essay question. Actually, they're going to ask you two, but you get to choose the one you're going to respond to. So what do those long essays look like? And this is an example of what they look like. You know, and you can see here that the first one says, evaluate the extent to which the Declaration of Independence marked a turning point in American history, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same from the period immediately before the Declaration to the period immediately following. And there's a theme in history, it's called continuity and change. How do things stay the same and how do they change? And they keep coming back to that. And so you can see that that's what they're asking here. You know, what changed and what stayed the same. And so being able to address that question would be an indication that you have an adequate knowledge of the Revolution. The second question is, some historians have argued the American Revolution was not revolutionary in nature. Support, modify, or refute this interpretation, providing specific evidence to justify your answer. Now, that's another way of saying assess the validity, right? I mean, if you think about the assess the validity questions that we did, there was a statement. For example, Theodore Roosevelt was a conservative, Woodrow Wilson was a liberal. Assess the validity of this statement, right? I mean, that was, I think, the question. Now, here it's saying, okay, some historians have argued the American Revolution was not revolutionary. Support, right? It was, it was not revolutionary. Modify, it was revolutionary in some ways and not in others. Refute, right? It was revolutionary. I mean, it's basically a version of accepting, assess the validity. And I made the point to the kids in the class that question one and question one here are to some extent the same question. Because if the revolution is revolutionary, then it meant that it fundamentally and foundationally changed things. So what is the first question about? Change and continuity. What's the second question about? Change or the lack of change, right? So there are similar questions, in terms of what they're asking for. But we'll get back to those, right? We'll get back to those. What we want to go to now is the American Revolution itself. So if you have your book, if you have this book and you wanted to jot notes down, you could do it in this thing where it says revolutionary period, right? Right here might be a place. I mean, I don't know how much we're going to say. We're going to say a lot. But, I mean, you might want to do it there because that's, an area you could, review. And you have your own notes, too. But I want to go back to the end of the French and Indian War. So, the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, is 1863. So in 1863 in class, we went through in class the French and Indian War. We ended it in 1863 with the Treaty of Paris, 63. And we talked at length, and I don't know if you remember this, but I was really, really excited about it. I read to you a quote from Benjamin Franklin, where he said, as a part of the discussion for the Peace Treaty of Paris in 63, that a union amongst the colonies is not merely improbable, it is impossible. So I was all excited. I don't know if you remember that, but I was all excited about that. I said, think about this. This is 1763, 13 years before the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Franklin, the embodiment of kind of the enlightened American, writing in London, kind of says, if you think these colonies are going to unify and seek their independence, that's not merely improbable, that is impossible. And so we use that as kind of a context. We said, okay, in an environment where Franklin did not see the possibility of Americans uniting and seeking their independence, what happens? What transpires that leads to the official Declaration of Independence, which is unifying and asserting independence, right? So what we said was that, look, the reason that Franklin made the statement that he did is that the 13 colonies that had to certain degrees assisted Britain in kind of fighting against the French and Indian in America were different. You know, these were 13 independently chartered colonies that were chartered for different reasons, that were established for different reasons. Some of them were established by joint stock companies like Virginia and Massachusetts. Some of them were proprietary colonies like Maryland and Pennsylvania. The topography and climate in these colonies were different. The availability of water and other resources were different. You know, the crops that could be grown there were different. The types of people that migrated there were different. And so you had 13 unassociated colonies that were widely diverse. And their commonality was they were part of a British Empire. And loosely they're connected to that British Empire. So when Franklin said to them, wrote that, you know, a union amongst these colonies is not merely improbable, it's impossible. It seemed to be reasonable. So what happens? Well, what happens is that Britain is going to attempt to change the status quo. And the way we organized it was this. We said, in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, Britain has a massive, huge, dynamic empire. They had defeated their foe, the French. This was the fourth and final war for empire, and they had really acquired and dominated this empire. They controlled all of North America. They had Caribbean possessions. They had Asiatic possessions. They had African possessions. They had a huge empire that they had to now maintain and pay for. And so this becomes the issue. And in North America, we said there were kind of three things. One was dealing with the problem of land distribution and Native Americans. The area west of the Appalachians. What would become of it? Now, look, the 13 colonies that were established, the centers of their population were all east of the Appalachians. Right? The Appalachian mountain range ran from New York all the way through Pennsylvania. That's what we call, Marissa, 7 Springs. You know how you like to ski there. All the way down through West Virginia, the mountains of West Virginia, that's the Appalachians. Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way through the Carolinas, North Carolina more particularly, down into kind of, you know, the western part of Georgia and Alabama. These were, now Alabama and Georgia, well, Georgia was there, but not Alabama. You know, this is the Appalachian Mountains. Most settlers were east of the Appalachians. West of the Appalachians were a smattering of settlers. What settlers did we say? What ethnicity did we say were the first Europeans to kind of go in British North America across the Appalachians and settle in the areas west? Does anybody remember that? It was a fun thing because we talked about they were the people that came Darius to this area here. Does anybody recall the first Europeans? Yeah, good. Not Germans. Not Germans, the other one. Scots-Irish. Right? Scots-Irish are the first that are going to migrate there. But part of the French and Indian War was for that great area west of the Appalachians. The problem was the Native Americans. Pontiac's rebellion is in 1761, and Pontiac's rebellion represents the Native Americans that inhabited that area, kind of responding to the results of the French and Indian War. You know, trying to push back the encroachment of British settlers. You know, and I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about Pontiac's rebellion, and I don't know if there'll be anything on the test about Pontiac's rebellion, but one thing that the AP is interested in is Native Americans, right? And the importance and influence of Native Americans in American history. And although we tend to marginalize them, Native Americans as kind of somebody to fight or somebody to push out of the way. If you think about it, the historians that claim that relations with Native Americans are very defining in, the kind of the story of America's past, this is an example of it. I mean, Pontiac's rebellion and the circumstances of the Native Americans west of the Appalachians and the potential to kind of have trade relations in them forced Britain, not forced Britain, but Britain responds to that with what piece of legislation that's passed by Parliament? Does anybody remember the legislation that Britain passed to deal with the problem of the Native Americans in the area west of the Appalachians, in the area, go ahead, Malay. Yeah, the Proclamation of 63. Sylvia, do you recall what the Proclamation of 63 was? If I were to call on your ex-best friend, Marissa, do you think she would know? Marissa?
No one was allowed to settle past the Appalachian.
Yeah. Marissa said it would not allow settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. All the white people had to go back east of the Appalachians. And so this seemed like a short-sighted and expedient action to kind of placate the Native Americans. But Britain's in a position where they don't want to fight wars. They don't want to spend any more money. And so they do this in response to the Native Americans. And the colonists who had fought the war in order to kind of win that territory are deeply embittered by this. I mean, yikes. We fought the war to liberate this territory. Now you're going to give it to the Indians who we continually have conflicts with? And so the alienation with British actions is going to, be evident there. And the importance of the Native Americans are evident there. Now, the other problem that Britain has is mercantilism, right? Now, I think in another review session, we are going to define mercantilism. But let's define it here anyways. I mean, mercantilism is that economic system in which the economic activity of the empire is regulated by the empire for the empire. Right? And there's Mr. Wheeler and kids.
I was told this little gathering wasn't going to happen. Because you came to the LGI. Do you recall that? Or?
What's today's date?
The LGI is taken.
Not today. Next, the 16th. The 16th is the day that...
What was I going to do?
I don't know. I know you'll be on YouTube.
If they don't know mercantilism, I'm turning in my badge.
Well, they do. They do know that.
I hope so. I beat that like a dead horse.
You beat mercantilism. So, Stephanie, you are very confident with your knowledge of mercantilism.
You say it different than I do, Pat.
So, pardon me?
You say it different than I do.
I think that mercantilism is kind of like an economic system where the empire regulates the economic activity of the empire for the empire.
Correct.
Right? They all do this, that the aspiration of mercantilism is to increase the pile of
bullion.
Right? That they all do that, to increase the pile of bullion by creating a favorable balance of trade. But the thing about mercantilism is that it required the government to regulate economic activity. Now, the original legislation that was passed by Parliament to regulate the economic activity of colonial America was called the Navigation Acts. Right? Now, the problem, and we said this, the problem was that the American colonies were, founded and grew. And the relationship between England and those colonies was a mercantilistic one that was defined by the Navigation Acts. But the British don't enforce the Navigation Acts. Right? The Navigation Acts and the regulation and the laws that the colonies are to follow, they don't. So the colonies are allowed to basically develop economically and to some extent politically and culturally in other ways as well, without really British oversight. In the aftermath of the French and Indian War in 1763, Britain, in deep financial problems for fighting 4 wars, right, is going to attempt to tighten up on mercantilism. And there's a couple of examples of that. You know, one is the issuance of the writs of assistance. Right? Does anybody remember what the writs of assistance were and who they were associated with? Yes?
They were global search warrants.
Perfect. They were global search warrants that were going to be used to enforce mercantilism, to prevent smuggling. So if you're violating the mercantilistic legislation, you're basically smuggling. You're participating in trade that is illegal under mercantilism. And so the writs of assistance were global search warrants that would empower royal officials and customs officials to search, for contraband and illegal trade. And the writs of assistance were things that had been issued in England and had been used, and they had actually been issued in America previously, but in 1761, when they were issued in an attempt to tighten up on mercantilism, they were challenged in court by the Boston merchants. And who defended the Boston merchants? Do you remember? Yes. Not John Adams. James Otis. James Otis. And Otis is going to argue that the issuance of the writs of assistance violate the natural rights of the colonists. Oh, do you remember that day when we talked about that? I was really excited on that day because remember, John Adams is going to write about the trial, and where Otis defends the Boston merchants against the writs of assistance, and John Adams is going to say, right 50 years after that day, that day in that courtroom, on that day, the child independence was born. And we made the point that Otis is going to argue on the basis of natural rights against the writs of assistance. Now, let's talk about this idea of natural rights. So, here are the 13 colonies that are widely diverse in a number of ways. But one way in which they are similar is a British tradition of government and law. And part of that British tradition of government and law was the idea of natural rights. That humans had natural rights by the virtue of their birth. This notion was Lockean. In other words, it came from the pen of John Locke, among others, who suggested that humans were born with the right to life, liberty, and property. And that the purpose of government was to protect and ensure those rights. And that government was a contract between the people and government. And in the center of that contract were natural rights. In other words, according to Locke, people had rights, but they couldn't defend those rights in a state of nature. And so they made a deal with government. They would obey and follow government if government would protect and ensure their rights. So the basis for government was rights. And what Otis is arguing here at that courtroom is that the writs of assistance violated that contract. That the writs of assistance violated the natural rights of the colonists in Massachusetts, and therefore would be illegally issued. That's the reason Adams is going to argue right then and there the child independence is born. I mean, the colonists are going to respond to the British actions, Britain's attempt to kind of right their affairs in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. I mean, the colonists are going to respond, and they're not going to like it, right? They're not going to like the Proclamation of '63. They don't like tighter mercantilism, and they particularly don't like additional taxes. But what Adams was saying is, what made kind of the child independence born there is it kind of goes from not liking to having that disdain justified on something that colonial Americans could rally around. Here are these diverse people that have diverse economic interests, cultural differences based on who they were, religious differences. You know, so what are they going to unify behind? Well, what they unify behind is their understanding of rights and government, which they share. So on some level, that's why Adam says right then and there the child independence is born. Now, besides the writs of assistance and Otis and John Adams and Samuel Adams in Massachusetts, right, kind of opposing British actions, the real dramatic thing that Parliament does is pass legislation that's intended to generate revenue. Those of you that have me in economics, a few of you, know this, that we have been just recently talking about the national debt. And, you know, the size of the national debt, the importance of the national debt, the impact of the national debt. Well, Britain's problem in the aftermath of the French and Indian War was a gigantic national debt. They had borrowed money from their citizens and from others to finance their war effort, and now they had to maintain that debt and pay the interest on that debt and service that debt. The interest on the national debt of England was enormous, and they were taxing their own citizenry, right, heavily. And they had a giant empire they had to defend from the Native Americans, from their opponents, they had to keep in line, and so fundamentally, they needed money, right? And so, even if you think about the Proclamation, that's an attempt to save money, because we don't want to fight the Indians, so we have the soldiers over there, right? Even if you think about tightening mercantilism, that's an attempt to collect more money, because they discovered that the people were, you know, not following mercantilistic legislation. It was costing them more to kind of enforce mercantilism than they were bringing in. And so all of this is an attempt to right their financial situation. And so the third thing that they are going to do is attempt to pass tax legislation. The two that I would know are the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is the quintessential one. That's the important one. Now, in fact, when we talk about the relationship between England and their colonies that eventually degenerates into the Revolutionary War, we kind of talk about it in three junctures: the Stamp Act crisis, the Townshend Act crisis, and the Tea Act crisis. And even if you're going to call them crises, or, you know, but basically, if you think about it, what's happening here is kind of defining the relationship between the colonies and the mother country, right? The Stamp Act symbolizes the first attempt to do so. And the Proclamation and the writs of assistance and the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act are all part of that category, the Stamp Act kind of crisis. Now, the problem with the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act is the stated purpose of those pieces of legislation were to generate revenue for England, for the crown. So in other words, the beef that the colonists at least said they had with the Stamp Act and with the Sugar Act is that the stated purpose of both of those pieces of legislation was to generate revenue. Now, they argued that generating revenue by taxation, by Parliament, violated their natural rights. Who can tell me how? How? I mean, they're arguing, look, this, you know, Adams is saying, you know, right then and there, the child independence is born because Otis raises the issue that the writs of assistance is a violation of their natural rights. That is reinforced with their response to the Sugar Act of '64, where the stated purpose is to generate revenue, and the Stamp Act of '65, where the stated purpose was to generate revenue. How then are both of those a violation. Dear Danielle, twice in a row I got it right. Now if I could just get Meredith. It was actually nice. Who would have thought? Yes, go ahead.
We didn't elect people in Parliament so that they didn't feel like they had the right to tax them.
Okay, so the fact that Parliament taxed them and that Parliament was not elected by them made it what? Well, they argue virtual representation, yes.
Yeah. Representation or taxation without representation.
Taxation without representation was theft, right? They argued, and Otis is going to coin this term, that taxation without representation is theft. So you have to pay the tax, right? You don't have a choice. And that's taking money from you. So if somebody takes money from you without your consent, what is it? Theft, right? Or extortion, but mostly theft. So how do you concede to be taxed? You elect the people that tax you. So if you vote for the people that tax you, then by electing them, you have conceded to allow them to tax you. So it is no longer taxation without representation. So taxation without representation is theft. Taxation without representation is tyranny. The response to both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act is to say that. But the response to the Sugar Act is relatively muted. The response to the Stamp Act is explosive. Why? What's the difference? Why is there a much more energetic? Go ahead, man.
Is it internal tax?
The Stamp Act was an internal tax. The Sugar Act was an external tax. What's the difference?
The internal tax taxed the colonies directly.
Yes. I mean, the Stamp Act was a direct tax that the colonists would feel and actually have to pay. Every piece of paper would have to have a stamp. The stamps would be affixed and the stamps would be a tax. Stamp tax was used in England. The external tax was a tariff. The Sugar Act was a tariff on French molasses. And the tariff would be reflected in the price of the molasses. So you really wouldn't see it, right, necessarily, but you would see the Stamp Act. So the Sugar Act was problematic, but the Stamp Act was an evident, tangible tax. So the response to that was explosive. Now, when you think about the response, what do you remember? As the Stamp Act is in the spring of '65. What do you remember? Go ahead, Blaine.
I remember the Stamp Act Congress.
Stamp Act Congress is one of the things that you recall. And that, now, here's a significant thing about the Stamp Act Congress. Look, the colonies couldn't get together in the Albany Congress to unify against the French and Indians, but they get together in the Stamp Act Congress to resist the Stamp Act. Go ahead, Darius.
Did they write the circular letter during this time?
That's later. That's the Townsend duties. Go ahead, David.
Sons of Liberty.
Sons of Liberty. Now, what's the Sons of Liberty connected with? The Sons of Liberty is a vigilante group. But what were they connected with? Go ahead.
The Boston Tea Party.
Well, yes. But I'm saying, you know, what did the Sons of Liberty were going to enforce something, Jackie? What did they enforce? Do you remember? Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Some non-importation.
Yes. The non-importation, the boycott. So in response to the Stamp Act, we're not going to buy anything from England. I mean, the value that the colonies had to England is that they were a market. The colonists bought finished products from England, and under mercantilism, they provided to England, you know, raw materials. I mean, the problem with imperialism in general, and that's what England had, an empire, a mother country and colonies, is that imperialism, mercantilism, is intended to enrich the mother country at the expense of the colonies, right? You know, I mean, that's why no one wants to be a colony, you know, because the mother country is going to be enriched. Now, there are going to be people, Americans and Britons in America, that benefit from the imperial relationship, right? Clearly. I mean, it's like any other imperial power. You know, when the French were the imperial overlords of Vietnam, right? You know, when France dominated Vietnam, were there Vietnamese in Vietnam that benefited from French imperialism? Certainly. Were there Vietnamese that were hurt by it? The majority, right? So the French, you know, imperial relationship is going to exploit Vietnam, just like the British imperial relationship is attempting to exploit the American colonies. You know, the reason that Americans had stayed with the British Empire so long is that Britain hadn't enforced it, right? They hadn't enforced that exploitation. So Americans circumvented, ignored, did whatever. Now, what's Britain trying to do? They're trying to, in America's mind, exert that exploitation, right? And the Americans are saying, well, you can't do that to us. We're just like you. We're citizens of the empire, just like you are. Clearly, the British didn't see them that way. The British saw them as kind of imperial subjects. The Americans saw themselves as equal citizens in the empire. And if they were equal citizens in the empire, then the imperial government had no right to violate their rights. You see? Right? So non-importation, the Sons of Liberty, the Stamp Act Congress, Patrick Henry's resolutions in opposition to the Stamp Act, right? The intimidation of the Sons of Liberty. Remember how much I talked about the destruction of Hutchinson's house, right? How excited I was about that. The mobs, how we read Zinn and Nash, and they talked about destroying Hutchinson's house and what motivated the mobs to do so. Oh, incidentally, what did Zinn think about motivated the mob in response to the Stamp Act to destroy Hutchinson's house? You know, anybody remember that? Yes.
Can you talk about the mobs being manipulated by?
Yes. He thought the mobs were manipulated by the outs in America. So I mean, the ins versus the outs. You know, what he meant by that is, look, there were a group of American leaders like Patrick Henry, like John Adams, like Samuel Adams, like George Washington, who were not favorites of the British Empire. But they were leaders in the colonies. And so they exploited the natural animosity of the masses in order to kind of take power. Remember, that was Zinn's argument. That is really inflammatory, but I couldn't get anyone to be like passionately angry about it. They just wait for me when I ask questions to kind of answer them, right? But, you know, I mean, that's this inflammatory argument. But anyways, back to the Stamp Act. What happens as a result of the explosive response? What happens with the Stamp Act? Does anyone, Stephanie, do you recall what happened?
Was it like the Declaratory Act?
Yes, it was repealed. And it was repealed with the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act said we can tax you if we want to. We just don't want to right now. Right? Now the Declaratory Act is important because what Britain is saying is that we're not repealing the Stamp Act because we agree with you. Oh, Marissa, tell us again before we leave the Stamp Act what the British response was to taxation without representation. Go ahead, dear Marissa. You said it before. Virtual representation. And I made that point to you. When the colonists rise up and argue that the things that are happening are violations of their rights, that's a British argument, right? I mean, the British are the ones that argue they had natural rights. The colonists had a British tradition of law and government. Locke, John Locke, and Lockean thinking was British. And so the British respond by saying, hey, you are represented in Parliament, virtually. Virtual representation, all of Parliament represented everyone in the empire. It is not taxation without representation. Everyone is represented. But if you think about it, it kind of suggests a sort of second-class imperial citizenship for colonies that weren't used to that. The colonists weren't used to having the imperial hand of England asserting itself, you know, in an exploitive way. Well, okay. The Declaratory Act eventually gives way to Townsend duties. The Townsend duties are external taxes, are they not, Matt? They are import duties, but they are import duties on products that are imported from England, therefore inconsistent with mercantilism. And the purpose of these duties is to generate revenue. We said that it took a little longer for the colonists to kind of get the indignation up against the Townshend duties than it did with the Stamp Act, but eventually it does rise up. How does the debacle over the Townshend duties end? I mean, the Townshend duties eventually are going, well, better question, that's a better, I don't want to say that. What does the enforcement of the Townshend duties lead to that's somewhat significant on the road to the revolution? So we have the Stamp Act crisis, which ends with the repeal of the Stamp Act and the passage of the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act is followed by the Townshend duties, which are these external taxes which the colonists eventually come to resent and to oppose. Now, those Townshend duties lead to a significant event. I'll give you a hint. It's in Boston. Oh, look, now there are people. Go ahead, Ian. You're just arrived. Oh, you didn't have your hand up. Go ahead, Joe. The Boston Massacre. How do the Townshend duties lead to the Boston Massacre? That's an outstanding question. Go ahead, Darius.
British troops were stationed inside Boston because
Why?
Boston was reticent in enforcing duties.
The Bostonians were resistant to the enforcement of the Townshend duties to the point of violence. And remember, they sent 4,000 redcoats to Boston, right, to protect the customs officials, to enforce these complex laws that were associated with trade. And eventually these troops that are in Boston are going to come into conflict with the Bostonians that are there in a violent altercation that cost the lives of, what do we say, seven colonists. Now, interestingly enough, there's lots with the Boston Massacre. You know, guess who was there? A powerfully built mulatto by the name of Crispus Attucks. And remember, you study that every day in the 8th grade. Every day is Crispus Attucks Day, right? And what did we say? You know, the fact that Crispus Attucks was, African in descent is certainly significant. And, but what did we also say was significant about Attucks and the other people who were surrounding him in that mob on that night? Who were they? Yeah, go ahead, Ian. No, they weren't the Sons of Liberty, though. Yes, go ahead. They were sailors, common folk, right, that were maybe the underside of Boston, who were frustrated with the soldiers for a number of personal and professional reasons. And so this kind of resentment of the soldiers might not have been fully ideological for Crispus Attucks and the people he was with. Yes? Alcohol was an issue. I mean, they had come out of the taverns. There had been hard feelings between these soldiers, fights, arguments over jobs, tensions that explode on this night. Now remember, in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, unrelated, it's not related, the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea, is repealed. And then there is a 3-year period between 1770 and 1773 of relative calm between the colonies and the mother country, where there is this kind of limited tea tax, limited Townshend duty on tea. Now, that calm is broken by what? What breaks the relative calm? Go ahead, John.
Boston Tea Party.
Well, back before the Boston Tea Party. Guys, Sylvia. Plastic. Go ahead, Megan. Go ahead, Matt.
The Tea Act.
The Tea Act. So what did the Tea Act do? Go ahead, Darius.
They tried to flood the colonial tea market, which had foreign teas, with cheaper teas, but this for some
It was going to save what company?
the East India, EITC.
Big day for the subcontinent. Right there, yes sir. Big day for the subcontinent. British East India Company teetering on bankruptcy, bailing out with with the Tea Act, exclusive monopoly between the British East India Company and America, biggest customer, biggest market for tea, right? Problems with the Tea Act is solidifying the tea tax. I mean, there was a lot of smuggling of Dutch tea that circumvented the tea tax that kind of assuaged Americans to think that they weren't actually paying it. Now, tea would be cheaper, the tax would be solidified, and it would give the East India Company a monopoly and alienate many of the merchants and middlemen that were involved in the tea trade. And so the Sons of Liberty and colonial Americans are going to resist, you know, the Tea Act by preventing the tea from landing, right, and being distributed, and intimidating people who might. Remember, I read that thing where the guy, you know, they got his like carriage and they destroyed it, and you know all the responses to the, you know, the Tea Act, you know, so they intimidated the people that would participate in the Tea Act. Well, eventually the final chapter is the Boston Tea Party, which I think you would mention, Joe, the Boston Tea Party. And the Boston Tea Party is a significant milestone in the relationship between England and the colonies. Why? You know, what is so significant? Things change in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party. Go ahead, Mike.
Because it led to the coercive act?
It did, but why does it do that? What, you know, I mean, Dominique, yes, it was a wanton destruction of property, right? Colonial Americans, thinly disguised as Indians, board British ships, carefully unload tea, you know, dump it into the harbors. In today's dollars, millions of dollars of product is destroyed. Now, in the aftermath of that, Britain says enough is enough. And they respond with the coercive acts or the intolerable acts. One of the coercive acts or one of the intolerable acts is to shut down the port of Boston, which is draconian, right? I mean, it is going to dramatically affect the standard of living of Bostonians. Town meetings are eliminated. A military governor is put in charge of Massachusetts. I mean, Britain is basically taking a firm stand. You know, we did say this. We did say that there was sympathy. I'm trying to think of something that would be analogous to this. But there was sympathy for Britain, even in colonial America. There were some that thought that the Bostonians had gone too far, that the Bostonians were troublemakers, that the Massachusettsians, if that's a word, were troublemakers, and you know that the destruction of property was inconsistent with their whole argument here. The intolerable acts are going to mute that criticism, because if the British can do the things they did to Boston, to any colonies, then those people became concerned. Darius has a thought that he'd like to share. Let's see what it is.
Well, if the colonists thought themselves as British colonists, right, as citizens, right, and they destroyed British property, aren't they technically destroying their own property?
Yeah, I mean, there was opposition to that. But when Britain responds with the coercive acts or the intolerable acts, then there is unity in purpose. And I think I even told you that even in Western Pennsylvania, they raised money to send it to Boston, to support the Bostonians. Now, what was the colonial response to the intolerable acts? The big colonial response. The big, significant colonial response. Go ahead, Matt, you're on fire. Go ahead.
All the colonies rallied around Boston.
Yes, they did. And they not only rallied around Boston, but they did what? Say it, Shane.
No, the first Continental Congress.
Yes, they held the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The first Continental Congress were delegates from all of the colonies, except for Georgia, which was prevented from attending, that rallied to talk about this. And they denounce, you know, the intolerable acts, and they establish a boycott, non-importation, and they urge the colonial governments to do the same. Look, the first Continental Congress was extra legal. It was not recognized legally by the British. It had no standing, but the colonial governments sent delegates. Most of the colonial governments' legislatures have been dissolved by their governors and were meeting by this time kind of illegally. So the First Continental Congress is an important milestone where the colonists are getting together. Lincoln later is going to say that's when the Union started. That the Union was older than the Constitution and older than the Declaration of Independence. The Union started with the First Continental Congress, when Americans got together for their mutual benefit for the first time. And one of the things the First Continental Congress urges the individual colonies to do is to arm themselves to fight for their rights. Now, did the First Continental Congress advocate for independence? No. No one is talking about independence. First Continental Congress is September of 1774. No one is talking about independence. What then do they want? What do the colonists ultimately want? What do they want? You know, go ahead, Joel.
You want to be equal citizens?
Yes, they want to go back to where they had been, unregulated and ignored, or respected as equal citizens by their own definition. Now, I mean, on some level in this kind of important notion of American identity, is Americans, do they realize at this point that they have a separate identity, right? I mean, the British are viewing the Americans differently than they view themselves, right? You know, they view themselves differently clearly than the British did, or they wouldn't do what they're doing. So this notion of an emerging American identity that is somehow different from England, right? I mean, can you start to see, because they're going to ask questions about it. They're going to say, they're going to want to know how certain things reflect American identity. Just a word about that. That debate today that we were talking about the League of Nations, that's an issue of an American identity. You know, are we a world leader or are we not a world leader? You know, I mean, you know, and that was on some level what was being debated there. You know, do we want to step forward? Are we isolated from the world and therefore different and remain isolated? Or do we have an obligation to lead the world to kind of a better place? I mean, that's a question of American identity. But anyways, back to, you know, the First Continental Congress. It convenes, it adjourns, says we'll meet again in May if we need to. What happens in the interim between September of 74 and May of 75? Big important events, yes. Concord and Lexington. Right? Concord and Lexington is a further attempt to isolate Boston. Right? Go out, capture the leaders, cut the head of this thing off. It shows kind of a lack of understanding. Most Americans support England, want to be part of the British Empire. If you just get rid of the rabble-rousers, everyone will fall into line. It results in this kind of conference. Oh, that was a big day too, wasn't it? Remember, we were at the Lexington Green and they were standing there, you know, drawn up on the Lexington Green. You know, the mightiest empire in the world and just average citizens with their muskets drawn. For what? I mean, there's an issue of identity there. You put your gun in the air and here comes the big bad British army that's marching down the road. What are you fighting for here? What is this all about? You know, what's at stake here? You know, and then even the Malden letter, remember the Malden Declaration where it articulated, there are issues there. Well, Concord and Lexington leads to the Second Continental Congress. Just one more minute, Stephanie. One more minute. I saw you and Darius look at the clock. Darius gets...
Actually, I was
not true.
I was looking at the reflection in the lights. I didn't want to look too stupid just looking up.
Just another minute. Let's just do the Second Continental Congress. Let's appoint Washington Commander-in-Chief, olive branch position, causes and necessities of taking up war, right? Taking up arms. All three of those things in the Second Continental Congress, correct? Right? Washington there's an army. Boston's at war. They dispatch George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of all colonial forces that are fighting for what? When Washington is dispatched, are they fighting for independence? No. Still not fighting for independence. In fact, the moderates at the Second Continental Congress are going to implore the Congress to send to the king an olive branch petition. Who is instrumental? Who's the leader of the moderates in the Second Continental Congress? From what state, what person? We saw the video. The kids should remember it like it was yesterday. Yusuf, this is your moment. You're going to answer a question. Are you ready? No, not the king. No, no.
I didn't say anything.
What did you say?
Sound
Not Adams. He's the leader of the moderates. Pennsylvania. Dickinson. Dickinson. Doesn't want to move to independence. Does not vote for the Declaration of Independence. Does not sign it eventually. But is loyal to independence. Because participated in the Constitutional Convention. Okay. Olive branch petition comes from Dickinson, who wants to reach out to the king. The king doesn't even read it. He declares the colonies in a state of rebellion and does what with German mercenaries? Yes. Hires the Hessians. Big turning point. Jefferson is going to produce a document out of the Second Continental Congress called The Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. The causes and necessities of taking up arms is not going to include, right, independence is one of the reasons. Now, Americans, the Congress and Americans are reluctant to embrace independence, to fully separate. What turns the tide? What turns the tide? Yes.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense, January of '76. I can ask no more of the kids. Joe, I can't ask any more. I'll lose them if I say another word. I have to conclude with common sense. Marissa, I can ask no more of them. Stephanie already looked at the clock once. I can't do any more. I'll lose them with another word. I have to send them on their way. Excellent review session. Thank you for your opinions. Who's this way? It's Garrett. He's our old friend Garrett. Yes, indeed. I'm going to send it.